connecting the roots, building network together for profit and purpose. We have a very distinguished presenter this afternoon, and she is, let me just introduce her. She is Wendy Cukier, the Professor of Entrepreneurship and Strategy and Academic Director of the Diversity Institute at the Ted Rogers School of Management, Ryerson University. Dr. Cukier is one of Canada's leading experts in disruptive technologies, innovation process, and diversity and inclusion. Wendy leads the Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub, funded by the Government of Canada, which promotes inclusive support for women and other diverse entrepreneurs. She has helped create the growth of several startups, which includes Flybit, Think, the Madeleine Collective, and Growing North. She's the recipient of several awards for her work in advancing diversity and inclusion, and it includes the Meritorious Service Cross, the Harry Jerome Diversity Award, YWCA Women of Distinction Award, WXN Most Powerful Women, and most recently, the Canadian Center for Diversity and Inclusion and Community Builders Award. She has an MA, MBA, and PhD in management, and 2 honorary doctorates. You must agree she's a very competent presenter on the topic for this afternoon, innovation, commercialization, and the creation of intellectual property. I present to you Dr. Cukier.
Thanks so much, and it's a pleasure to be here with all of you. I hope that during my presentation you'll use the chat box if issues come up that are of interest that I'm not covering. I'll try to multitask and shift. I know that it's a very diverse group today from around the world with a lot of different sort of backgrounds, but I'm going to focus specifically on issues around innovation and commercialization, how the Canadian system works and how it doesn't work. And I'd like to share my screen. Hopefully it will work. Maybe it will and maybe it won't. I think I have to do something else. Just a second. The
bottom menu bar, look to the bottom for the green button.
Yeah, no, I have to actually find the slides.
Nice. Okay, good.
Which are hidden from me for some reason. Sorry. Oh, that's very strange. Let's see here. Oh dear. Here it is, here it is, here it is. There we go, there we go. Okay, so just let me, isn't it always the case, you just, when you're planning to do something clever, it doesn't work. This is the right presentation. I'm in the right place, right? So I'm going to talk about innovation commercialization and, as I said, how the ecosystem works in Canada and how it doesn't work. And I'm hoping that people will ask questions as we go along. So the first question is really around innovation and what is innovation? And a lot of people equate innovation with what I would call invention, the creation of new technologies or applications. But in fact, innovation is about doing things differently. So if you create a new technology and nobody uses it, it's not actually an innovation. On the other hand, if you think of a new way of doing things, whether it includes technology or not, that is innovation. So I think that fundamentally, one might say that a lot of the people in engineering and computer science hijacked the agenda and pushed for, you know, thinking about technology as the only form of innovation. But when we look at Canada, for example, there are many, many people who are running innovative companies who are not making technology. They're not patenting anything, but they're using technology in an innovative way. That is an innovation. If you have a farmer who is using new techniques to intensify agriculture, whether they're inventing new technology or not, it's innovation. And one of the things I think, apart from the terrible, terrible damage that COVID has wrought, it's actually accelerated the pace of innovation, the pace of the adoption of new technologies in many, many sectors. So think about it. You know, we've talked about the internet and teleeducation and e-learning and e-health and e-government for many, many years, but there have been all sorts of impediments to the adoption of technologies to achieve those goals. And literally in days, many universities, many hospitals, many government agencies transformed themselves. That's innovation, and not a patent was filed. So we have to remember that innovation isn't just about creating technologies, it's about using them. And I love to, if you look at the blue box on the left, I love that quote because it shows A, I'm old, and B, I studied history before I switched to business. But in 1990, we were talking about computerized medical records. And it really has only been within the last couple of months that we've seen that technology deployed. We know that there's a big problem in Canada. We have lots of scientists, we have lots of engineers, we have lots of money that we're spending on research. One of our biggest problems, whether we're talking about artificial intelligence or the Internet of Things, or even relatively simple technologies, social media systems, for example, what we find is there's a big gap between the technologies that are available and the technologies that are actually used. And that has created what I would call an innovation gap. So it's important to remember that, that innovation is different in different sectors. It takes different forms. It can be about creating a new product or service. It can be about creating a new process, or a new technique that improves efficiency and effectiveness. And I think it's really important in a country as diverse as Canada not to be preoccupied with one kind of innovation in one sector. Because if all you do is focus on technology, for example, you're really ignoring a lot of the really interesting innovation that occurs outside of the big cities. And incidentally, innovation that occurs within diverse communities, especially, you know, Indigenous people, for example. So as I mentioned, the big issues in Canada are really around the gap. We invest a lot in research and development. We don't see it translating into productivity improvements. And I have my own theory about that. You know, I think part of the issue, there used to be a term called the productivity paradox. This is from 30 years ago, but it applies today. So the argument was, we're investing all this money in technology, and yet we're not seeing our productivity improve. Why is that? Well, my answer to why is that is because in some cases, companies invest in technology, they make good use of technology, and they get good results from technology. In other cases, companies invest in technology and don't get good results. So I think the reason we have a productivity paradox is some companies get huge payoff and some companies get no payoff. and it levels out, so we don't see any change. There's no question that some companies are growing spectacularly because of their smart use of technology. Shopify, for example, which is an electronic platform for selling, essentially, and a Canadian company, is now bigger than the biggest bank in Canada. And its growth spurt came during COVID because so many companies were shifting to online distribution of their products and services. Little known fact, Shopify is actually the platform Kylie Jenner used, one of the Kardashians, to become a billionaire at the age of 20. So again, while we may think of entrepreneurs as the people who make the technology, the Steve Jobs, the Mark Zuckerberg, and so on, the fact is billionaires are being created by intelligent use of technology. And that's, in my view, a much bigger opportunity across a lot more sectors than being preoccupied with who's going to develop the latest software app. I think the other thing that we're seeing right now, especially accelerated by COVID, is of course, huge unemployment, and huge unemployment that is affecting particular segments of the population. Particularly, I mean, women have been set back 3 decades. Some of that is because of the sectors that women tend to work in. Some of that is because of the burden of childcare, home care, and so on. But we also see it with immigrants and racialized populations because they are also often in the sectors most affected. So COVID has not affected people in the same way, whether we're talking about the disease itself or the economic impacts. And as I said, when we think about innovation, it's important to me, at least, to think beyond information communications and technology. It's important to think beyond biotech. It's important to think beyond the areas like manufacturing, which people are preoccupied with in terms of automation, and to think about what does innovation mean when we're looking at agri-food? What does innovation mean when we're looking at infrastructure? What does innovation mean when we're looking at retail or education or healthcare? And I think that orientation is critically important if we're actually going to drive economic development and growth. And yet, my argument is, if you look at Canada's current strategy around innovation, or you look at what most incubators and accelerators are focused on in Canada, it's a very narrow sliver of the economy, and we need to do better. The other thing that I think is very, very important is that innovation, there's nothing about innovation or entrepreneurship that links it specifically to profits or economic outcomes. All innovation is doing something new. An entrepreneur is somebody who thinks, puts together new combinations and creates new products or services. Nothing says an entrepreneur has to be focused on getting rich or that innovation has to be focused on growing markets. In fact, I would argue, especially at this time, we need to understand the importance of social innovation and social entrepreneurship. And ironically, these concepts are often better developed in emerging economies, places like India, for example, parts of Africa, and so on, where necessity is the mother of invention. And so we talk about innovation from below. We see people coming up with incredibly innovative approaches to solving problems that are really significant. And, you know, there's the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations kind of cover the gamut. It's not to say that you can't be trying to develop good health and making a profit. It's not to say that you can't be focused on innovation and infrastructure and not making a profit, or driving the development of jobs and economic growth, almost by definition making a profit. It's more to say that we need to keep a broader understanding when we think about our investments in innovation and entrepreneurship, and not just focus on how many people are creating fast-growing jobs that export, or fast-growing companies that export and create jobs. Because I would argue, for instance, that it's great if you have one SME that grows to 1,000 people, but having 10 that have 100 amounts to the same thing, or having 100 that have 10, or 1,000 that have one employee. It's all job creation. And I think we have to avoid focusing too much on scale as the only measure of success, especially if we want to include smaller communities and rural communities. And finally, I would say, if you think about the world's to-do list, as the Sustainable Development Goals have been called, if you think about the impact of things like climate change, or environmental degradation, or in the current environment, lack of attention to healthcare, I think you can see that these things are all really interconnected, and it's very difficult to separate out what are social goals from what are economic goals. So when we think about the innovation ecosystem, what we're talking about is basically the network of players and entities that come together to drive and impede innovation. And so you see, we talk about things at the societal level. Culture has a huge impact on innovation. Nigeria has a much higher percentage, for example, of women in entrepreneurship than Canada does. Part of that is driven by necessity, but a lot of it is driven by culture, government policies, taxation, infrastructure, access to the internet, broad socioeconomic trends. Those are all things at the societal level that affect the opportunities or the barriers that entrepreneurs face. If you look at the organizational level, you can think about all the different kinds of organizations that can help make or break entrepreneurs. So of course, it's really important to think about financial institutions and investors and angel networks and so on. But it's equally important to think about colleges and universities, which typically provide training. They provide access to research and intellectual property. I'll talk more about that. Or the organizations that support businesses. These are the accelerators, the incubators, the chambers of commerce, and so on. Or the growing companies that and business networks that actually create markets for the products and services. And we think that procurement, the use of buying power, is one of the biggest levers you have to drive entrepreneurship growth in anywhere. Because if governments and banks and big companies decide that they are going to put a focus on supporting small business, supporting businesses led by women, supporting businesses led by immigrants, supporting businesses led by Indigenous people, etc., that can have a profound impact on the opportunities for those businesses. And then at the end of the day, there's also individual level factors. Do people think about entrepreneurship as an attractive career option? Do people respect entrepreneurs? Do people understand women can be entrepreneurs? Do the individuals who are making decisions about giving financing, investing, and so on, what are the factors that shape their belief systems, their behaviors, who they support and who they don't support? We have lots of research, and I won't go into it in great detail, we have lots of research that shows that there's what I would call friction in the Canadian innovation and entrepreneurship ecosystem, meaning doesn't work as smoothly as it should. The pieces don't necessarily work together as a system. We have a lot of programs aimed at supporting entrepreneurs, but they don't necessarily connect together. Some of the programs, frankly, are very exclusionary. They work well for people in certain sectors. They work well for men. They may work well for certain kinds of men, but they don't work for everybody. So we put a lot of our energy into trying to understand what works and what doesn't work and how to make it work better. And I'm not going to go through this again because I think I've already talked about the different levels of the ecological model. But it suffice it to say that if you want to grow entrepreneurship, if you want to drive innovation, you have to make sure that you're looking at those societal issues, you're looking at organizational policies and practices, and you're also trying to reach the minds and hearts of individuals, both to inspire them to become innovators or entrepreneurs, and also to encourage other people to support them. So in the Canadian ecosystem, we don't actually know exactly how many incubators and accelerators there are because it changes only on a weekly basis. And an incubator and accelerator is really an organization. It can be for-profit, it can be non-profit, it can be a combination of fee-for-service and government supported that really is there to start up and grow businesses. And so typically they will provide space, they will provide training, they will provide mentoring, they may provide access in terms of IP, they may provide networking, coaching, and certainly in some instances, they provide opportunities for someone to showcase their products and services in a way they wouldn't if they were working in their garage or their basement or at home. And, you know, one of the incubators I know the best is the DMZ at Ryerson, which is one of the top ranked in the world. And it's at the corner of Bay and Dundas, the busiest street corner in all of Canada. One of the biggest things the DMZ offers to the people who work there is access. So you will have, you know, billionaires walking through the DMZ to see who's doing what that's cool and saying, I'll take one of those. And a lot of the companies that have grown out of the DMZ and been very successful have benefited from that kind of access and visibility and profile. And one cannot underestimate how critical that becomes. Some of them have a specialized focus, although I would say the biggest ones in Canada are almost all focused on technology, much to my chagrin. There's the biomedical zone, there are different innovation centers focused on health tech. You have some that are focused on social innovation. You have some that are like Foodpreneur, which is focused specifically on people in the food industry. But by and large, the incubation acceleration model in Canada has really been kind of hijacked by the tech side of the world. And you can understand why, because investors are looking for high growth, and everyone knows the stories of the companies that went from zero to being valued at $1 billion. But I would argue that the kinds of supports that are provided to tech startups and scale-ups should also be provided to people who are developing, the next best hot sauce or sewing designer masks. Like there are huge opportunities to support micro businesses, to create jobs and opportunities that I think are being missed. And we work with, we have 6 or 7 programs across the country, for example, that are focused specifically on immigrants and refugees. one of our favorites is Market 707, downtown Toronto. It's a container market. And what it does is give entrepreneurs who are in retail food services an opportunity to have storefront space at a very affordable rate. There's a community kitchen, so if people are cooking things on scale or catering, they have access to those services. So in my mind, we need to think much more broadly about what the opportunities are to support growing businesses. And the other thing I think I'll say is that these incubators and accelerators have wildly different approaches. So some, it's just pay to play. You pay a certain amount, you get a hotspot or an office and access to certain services. Some, on the other hand, are incredibly competitive, and it's like winning the Nobel Prize to get into them. And some are sort of in between, where if you get in, the owners of the incubator, and Singularity is like this, will take a stake in your company. So obviously the companies they pick are going to be the ones they think will grow because they're going to get a piece of the action. So there are a lot of different models for incubators and accelerators, and it's really, really important if you're considering one that you're very clear about what the opportunity is and also what it's going to cost you. As I said, in my experience, and there's some research to support this, our incubators and accelerators in Canada are mostly tech focused. I would say along with that comes a certain kind of culture, which is not friendly for women and others. And there have been a lot of, well-publicized stories about some of those issues. We know that in Canada, because we've done some research, that they don't often provide the same level of support that newcomers need. And in Toronto, for example, half the population was born outside the country. It's a huge opportunity to leverage, international knowledge, to develop new markets and potentially export and so on. At the same time, we know that newcomers often have a steep learning curve in terms of the regulations that affect, food production or the employment standards or taxation policy or whatever. And so they need different kinds of support than folks who are born in Canada. And we also have seen, and this is partly again back to the disciplines, because of the heavy focus on science, technology, engineering, and math, where we see lots of racialized people, but we don't necessarily see a lot of Black people at Canadian universities. There's a real underrepresentation of the Black community, and a number of programs have been developed to specifically try to address those issues. And we're working really, really hard to try to create more variety, more diversity, and more inclusion, and also to test out new models, like I mentioned, Foodpreneur, like incubators targeting artists, because artists are all entrepreneurs. They just don't know it. All artists who are going to make a living need to have basic skills in terms of finance and marketing and managing their businesses, just as if they were developing an app. So by trying to build more supports for people who are not in tech, we think that we will both help grow the Canadian economy, but also improve diversity and inclusion. Traditionally, the models of commercialization have been very much driven by universities, by science, technology, engineering, and math. And I won't go into this in detail, but I don't know if anyone on the phone works in pharma, for example. But, if you're looking at developing pharmaceuticals, there's a research stage, and then, you know, it has to be tested, and then, you know, potentially commercialization, and so on and so forth. And often the life cycle of drug development is decades, not just months or years. On the other hand, when we look at some technologies, the life cycle is months, not decades, where someone comes up with a clever idea for an app and it takes off. So the traditional model of commercialization is very much based on this idea that someone does research, and then the research gets tested, and then maybe someone invests in the research, and then maybe it goes to market, et cetera, et cetera. And as I said, this works for drugs, but most drugs take 10 to 26 years. I would be dead by the time it was ready, and costs between costs hundreds of millions of dollars to develop. And these models are quite well understood. If you're looking at health in particular, very complex because of the regulatory structures. In fact, many health tech professionals in Canada don't even try to enter the Canadian market. They go straight to global markets, which are easier to penetrate. We know that tech is key. You know, my PhD's in technology. I would never say technology is not important. I love technology as much as I have trouble with Zoom. And so because tech is such a high growth sector, that's part of the reason why people are always looking for the next new thing that's going to make them a bazillionaire. And we know that the tech diffusion cycles are completely different than what we see from pharmaceuticals. Literally, you know, they're getting shorter and shorter and shorter. If you think about how quickly you know, the iPad took off, or something of that sort, compared to the amount of time it took to get a color TV. And so one of the things that is really important if you're working in a product area, and I would say food is one of these, like food, fast market cycles. Like you do have regulatory requirements and so on, but fashion, food, I can't think of anything else. Fashion and food in particular would be examples of industries with incredibly fast innovation cycles. And so that kind of linear, let's study it, let's decide, let's get some money, let's move forward, that linear model of innovation and commercialization just doesn't work in a lot of areas. And so, you know, one of the things we also have to think about are more iterative models, where you have an idea, you develop a prototype, you test the prototype, you make changes as you go along, and you focus on getting it out the door as quickly as possible with a minimum viable product, and then you iterate as you go forward. And we've had a lot of fun and heartbreak working with this kind of model with all sorts of things, everything ranging from you know, development of apps or technologies or services, through to new approaches for resettling Syrian refugees, or free online tutoring services, or different kinds of social innovation. So it's important to understand that there's no right or wrong answer, but it's really critical that you match the innovation process and approach to the sector that you are in. And you know, lots of evidence that we need to be more proactive, especially in Canada, in figuring out ways to monetize research and get research to market. And so a lot of the incubators and accelerators will help with the assessment of the market potential, will help with protecting your intellectual property and ensuring you understand what the different options are, especially if you're starting to work through relationships with investors and so on. So What do we think entrepreneurs need? I think this is not that different around the world, but I'll be interested in your comments. Financing is critical, skills development, coaching, social capital, mentoring, and so on. One of the things we like to say is financial capital without social capital doesn't get you very far. And most serious investors now will insist on not just contributing money, but also contributing oversight, management, and other kinds of support. We also know that one size does not fit all, and that we really need to be more sensitive to the differences between, you know, someone who's developing a new, you know, genetic marker in order to test a drug versus someone who's developing a new hot sauce, or, you know, beauty product, or clothing line. And I would argue they're equally valuable. One of the things I'm really excited about is we've been asked to work with a number of music organizations on music incubators. And why I think this is really exciting is because if you look at the richest women in Canada, what you will find is some pick their families or married well. And so you have a lot of family businesses where someone inherited the business. You have a handful of very successful self-made women who, you know, had an idea, commercialized the idea, and marketed the idea and became billionaires. Very few. But guess who the most, the remainder of the richest women in Canada are? Celine Dion, Shania Twain, Nelly Furtado. And I think, what's her name? The actress, the blonde actress from Sex and the City is up there too, Kim Cattrall, okay? So these are self-made women. These are women who have turned their popularity into a brand. These are women who have built businesses, often with, you know, fashion and other things associated with them. But we wouldn't immediately think Celine Dion, entrepreneur. And yet, that is an incredibly, potentially lucrative pathway to success, especially in our current, you know, celebrity culture kind of environment. So one of the things I'm most excited about is working with some of the music industry organizations to develop incubators focused on musicians. Because, you know, what's the difference between someone with talent and someone who's a billionaire in the music industry? Often has to do with the same kinds of things: access to markets, access to mentors, access to people who can help them navigate the business. And yet often those skills are not provided to people in the arts. So we're really focusing on making sure we have a much broader approach to what incubation and acceleration is. We also think it's really important, in addition to recognizing differences across sectors, to understand differences in the stages of growth of SMEs. And so the kinds of things that people need when they're really starting out are very different than the things that they need when they're scaling. And the kinds of money, you know, one of my passion projects right now, for example, is taking a page from the Global South and trying to develop more microcredit and micro grant programs, because I have seen with my own eyes multiple cases, multiple cases where you can give someone $2,000 and they can build a business. You can give someone a $5,000 loan, they can build a business. And I think too much of our focus is on the high end, and we don't have enough support for people who are just starting out. So we're working really hard to try to fill some of those gaps. And again, the training and support that's required at different stages are very different. And we work really hard with a lot of our partners to try to provide very targeted training. One of the things that we observe, for example, and this applies to African, Black, and Caribbean entrepreneurs in Canada, it applies to Indigenous entrepreneurs, it applies to women and some other groups, is they're more likely to be self-employed than they are to have incorporated their business. Now, why might that be? Well, part of it is that people think incorporating your business is expensive and challenging. And that may be so, although, you know, you can do it for about $200. But what I would argue is if you're serious, growing your business with other people's money is the way to go. And you're more likely to get other people's money if you're incorporated. Banks are more likely to take you seriously. You're going to qualify for, you know, for funding from Global Canada and others if you're an incorporated entity. You're not if you're just self-employed. And I know lots of self-employed people are very successful, you know, earning hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. They have subcontractors, they don't have employees, they work from home and so on. But the reality is they're often self-financing on their credit cards or using their mortgage and their personal assets to grow their business. And there are real advantages to trying to separate those two things apart. So we're putting a lot of energy into trying to encourage the million, for example, women entrepreneurs in Canada to consider incorporating, because right now there are only about 114,000 women-led small medium enterprises. So that's something, just in terms of training and support, is an example of something very concrete that can open up opportunities. And this looks at women, but I would suggest to you we would see a similar pattern if we looked at people who self-identified as Black, in terms of less access to financial institutions, less access to angel investments and venture capital. And we've heard, you know, our share of horror stories of people having problems getting financing. So we're focused on some of that. Exporting, hugely important. And one of the things we really prioritize is how to leverage immigrant diasporas in particular. And it was interesting. I was chairing a session on exporting that EDC Canada organized with 3 women. And as it turned out, they were in completely different sectors. And one of them was South Asian, and but they were all born in Africa. And so their whole approach to the world was very different than someone who was born in Canada, because often Canadian-born entrepreneurs see the world as this big, whereas if you're born somewhere else, you've lived somewhere else, your world is the oyster. And so one of the things we're really interested in is trying to better harness the diaspora, but also link immigrant entrepreneurs with Canadian-born entrepreneurs to try to create mutually beneficial relationships, where some of the immigrant entrepreneurs may need more help in navigating the Canadian system and getting contacts and so on. Whereas the Canadian entrepreneurs can access the immigrant entrepreneurs' deep knowledge of global markets and opportunities. And there's really good evidence to suggest that companies that export grow faster and are more innovative. And Canada really lags behind the world in terms of its exporting and importing, you know, the number of entrepreneurs that have a global footprint, and that this is really a challenge to our growth. We have a bunch of new trade agreements that have created new opportunities. And one of our big priorities is trying to is to promote trade and collaboration. We're also very focused on getting incubators, accelerators, banks, universities, and others to really take a hard, cold look at their processes to make sure that they're not unintentionally excluding people and they're using all the levers at their disposal, whether it's procurement or whether it's, you know, their philanthropic opportunities to create, or philanthropic initiatives to create more opportunities for people who are typically not included. And we know in Canada that, you know, people who self-identify as Black are a growing percent of the population, but right now we see them as being less likely to be self-employed than the general population. And so we see that as a big growth opportunity. We also, and this is the Black Business Professional Association, many of you may know Nadine Spencer, did an analysis of her membership and compared it to the Canadian Federation of Independent Business. And the results were pretty bad in the sense that what they showed was that Black entrepreneurs were less likely to get access to government programs. They were more likely to be on the verge of closing down. They were more likely to have very limited financial assets and to be very hard hit by COVID. And that's part of the reason why, you know, the federal government in Canada is dedicating some specific funds. We know that this is also a function of the fact that businesses owned by African, Black, and Caribbean people tend to be smaller, micro businesses under 1 to 4 employees. And the same is true with women-led businesses. Smaller businesses, more fragile, more vulnerable to COVID. And I compare it, you know, in my arguments with the government, I compare these businesses to the seedlings, right? If you let them all die, you aren't going to have any forests in 20 or 30 years. So we're really preoccupied with this issue of the pipeline and making sure more and more resources are available. And if anyone's interested, you know, we can provide the slides with the links, but just so you have a sense of the range of programs that are available. They have different requirements, they have different criteria, and all of them have paperwork, which is often hard to navigate. But there definitely are increasingly programs that are really targeting different groups. We worked with the Ontario Chamber of Commerce, for example. They had $5,000 no strings attached grants available for companies, I think over a certain $250,000 in sales to cover certain COVID costs. Free money, take it. There are a lot of different programs out there, and sometimes navigating them is the biggest problem. So we work with Magnet. We have a portal that provides, you know, access to services. We run a bunch of incubators. I mentioned one with Scatting Court, which is very community focused, very focused on low income immigrants and refugees. And then we work with high-end incubators that are looking at companies that are $1 million plus sales. Lots of work from the federal government. And there was recently an announcement specifically aimed at supporting the Black community. There are a lot of organizations, this is by no means a comprehensive list, that are aimed at supporting the Caribbean community, the African community, in French, in English, focused on women, focused on you know, people in tech, people in finance, youth, and so on. And we work with a number of these organizations as well. So that's kind of a quick overview of what the world looks like in Canada when it comes to incubators and accelerators. And if I have time, I'm pleased to take a few questions. I can see things in the chat box.
Certainly, I think we still have another 9 minutes. And I was able to identify a question coming from where I thought I highlighted it. Yes, Simone Sheriff. And her question are the points being made by Wendy on innovation and SDGs pertinent to your understanding of social enterprise?
Yeah, that's exact. I mean, social innovation, social entrepreneurship typically are focused on advancing the sustainable development goals. And sometimes it's a piece and sometimes it's the focus. So I would argue in the current environment, most organizations, whether they're for-profit or nonprofit, have some measure of commitment to the SDGs. I mean, with big companies, it may be minimal. It may be, you know, that they have a corporate social responsibility program and they give out some money and they're environmentally friendly and they have a diversity and inclusion policy. They may check those boxes. Whereas some social enterprise may be focused very specifically on you know, environmental issues or whatever, but a lot of organizations are a blend. And, you know, it's not a popular comment, but I do make it anyways, that I actually believe that talking about social entrepreneurship or social innovation is like talking about lady doctors. You use the adjective because you view them as exceptional and it has the impact of marginalizing them. I would prefer if we could talk about entrepreneurs and innovation and everyone understood that it included social as well as for-profit. Hugely important when we look at Indigenous communities where if you go in and say, do you want to be an entrepreneur and make money? They're not interested. If you go in and say, do you want to help your community? Suddenly it's a very different response. And I think we need to kind of reclaim what an entrepreneur and what an innovator is and make sure that that's inclusive. Any other questions?
Okay, sorry, my mic was on mute. I thought I am able to identify a question here from Megan. We have, I think, about 4 or 5 more questions. Your average diaspora entrepreneur operates in 3 spaces versus 1 for others. Mainstream and diaspora twinned in a formula for success. Born global or born again global is a must. Any comments on that?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. I mean, it's not that going global is easy, and it is more complex, but it's potentially more rewarding. And I do think I like that expression is around the twinning. I think that's critically important.
And then we have a request from Marva Dennis. Please post the links for the business financing.
Yes, what I'm going to do is I will follow up with the organizers to make sure that that they have the presentation as well as the links, and there's also stuff on our website.
Thank you. And there is another comment from Megan who mentioned that it's interesting that many did not see BIDEM 2020 as something they would sponsor. And that goes to the point where you mentioned that there are barriers to support.
Yeah, for sure. And I noticed Temu asked the question that Black-owned businesses had it said Black-owned businesses had greater capacity to take on debt than Canadians. I actually think it's the other way around, that non-Black Canadians had more capacity to take on debt because for two reasons. One is they're better financed, and B, there's something that we observe in, and this is research out of the States, but I think it applies here too. It's called discouraged borrowers. And that applies to women, and it also applies to Black entrepreneurs and others. And a discouraged borrower is someone who has been so subject, in this instance, to anti-Black racism or discrimination or not being taken seriously, that they just don't try anymore, that they expect to be turned down by the bank. They find, you know, mainstream institutions as largely hostile. And that's true of women as well. Like, women are terribly underfinanced. They don't even try anymore. They'd rather use their credit cards and brag about the fact that they don't have any loans. And we really need to work on financial literacy because, as I said, especially in the current environment with zero interest and low interest loans available, you're way better growing your business with other people's money.
Beautiful. And just before we take the next question, we'd just like to recognize Ambassador Thelma Phillips Brown, who has joined the conversation. We want to welcome you. The next question is coming from Dr. Anne Ingraham, and the question is, I'm glad to see your mention about innovation addressing the SDGs. I think emerging innovative technologies can aid to overcoming some of the barriers to achieving the goal. And
yeah, I would agree 100%. And it's not necessarily, you know, especially when we're looking at rural communities in Canada, for example. I think we could learn as much from rural communities in other countries as we could from the approaches taken in cities. So, you know, one of the examples I always talk about is the solar cooker, which, you know, costs, I don't know what the cost is, but the use of like small scale solar energy, small scale microgrids for communications, running things on iPhones rather than computers. A lot of those approaches have been developed out of necessity in other countries, and those could actually be very helpful and relevant in underserved communities in Canada, especially the North. Like 30% of Indigenous communities in Northern Ontario, last time I checked, do not have clean water available. So, you know, some of the conditions we have in Canada really require immediate action and innovative approaches.
Dr. Cukier, I think we have come to the end of our session, and really appreciate your challenge for us to be innovative about our thinking of the definition of innovation, in the sense that it's not just limited to inventing new things, but more so how the technologies, how the methods, how the approaches are used. And we want to thank you for spending the time, for donating your time. We really appreciate it on behalf of BIDEM 2020 and the entire team. We want to say thanks a whole lot, and may you continue your excellent work in this.
Thank you so much. It was my pleasure, and have a great conference.
Thank you. I think we shall turn over.
Oh, 1 second before Dr. Cukier go, I'd just like to mention, to say my own quick little thanks to Dr. Cukier and also to the WEC Hub. the Ryerson Institute of Diversity, and in particular the WEC Hub, is the sponsor of our conference app. So I must say, and we also met on the barrier front about 2 years or 2.5 years ago, until we came with a nice little friendship with Megan, who is a program manager there. And that's why I like to confront, go deal with the thing straight face to face, not walk away and have the resentment, but go and deal with the matter. And I must say, this is the only entity who thought it was a good idea to put their capital behind this event, and we have strong support from Global Affairs, apart from our board member, Dr. Benzi, and our own individual contributions. So I want to say big salute and thank you, Dr. Cukier, in more ways than one. Wish we had you in the morning with more people, but they will have access to, and it's I enjoy this is spot on, and I like the fact that you took away that stigma that it's tech company that's going to do innovation and cause change that's permanent. No, if it's even as strategic management consultants to go work with tech companies, build systems, I'm wondering now, what can I, because as a corporate strategy plan or evaluator or something like that, tech is going to put me in some problems, because if I'm not firing at the top end, then tech is going to take a big chunk of what I do. So thank you again, and thank you, Errol. Have a wonderful day, Dr. Cukier.
My pleasure. Have a great conference. Congratulations.
Thank you so much. Looking forward to future work. Thank you, Errol. Wonderful.
Yes, so also minorities, and in the context of Canada, folks who are from immigrants, the barriers that exist in immigrants, minorities, um, um, uh, um, who are the barriers that prevents the access to funding and to actually being able to access resources for to do their innovation. She also mentioned several areas in which we could just take a new look at what innovation involves. And that includes things like agri-foods, infrastructure, retail, education, healthcare. She mentioned the music industry. She mentioned the what we would call and she highlighted some folks who are among some of the top innovators, which were there in the arts, entertainment. She challenged us to think innovation, to make it. In fact, she tried to identify some of the gaps involved in innovation gaps that prevents, and in the context of Canada, prevents innovation, prevents productivity being much more realized. And there was an interesting quotation that she had earlier in the slides, which spoke about the interchangeability, or referred rather to the lack of interoperability between the different types of health records being shared. She mentioned a slide or a quotation which went back as far back as, I think, if my recollection, I didn't have notes on that, gone back as far as in the 90s, identifying the difficulties in taking advantage of the changes that's there to facilitate the transfer of medical records from one institution to the next. That was my take from that.
Mr. Moderator, let's roll with